Way back in the 1990s, I attended a gathering of Unitarian Universalist ministers held at the Yokefellow Institute, a Quaker conference center in Richmond, Indiana. Our invited guest presenter was the Reverend Roy Phillips, who was at that time the minister of Unity Church, Unitarian in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was going to lead us in a workshop about preaching. I felt an immediate kinship with Roy when he revealed that he was a collector of postcards, because that's something I also did and still do. But I usually buy two, mail one, and save one for my collection. But it's how Roy used his postcards that really captured my imagination. He spread out at least 100 of them on this enormous polished wooden table in the center of the main conference room. And then he invited the 20 of us in attendance to walk around the table and to choose 3 postcards, or rather to have them choose us, as he put it. What attracts you? What gets your attention? What troubles you, perhaps, or puzzles you, or delights you, or frightens you in these images? And once we had gathered our cards, he gave us 5 minutes on our own to create some kind of narrative that tied those 3 images together. We were to prepare a 5-minute sermon to be given without notes to our colleagues that would tell some kind of story connecting the images on those 3 cards to each other and to us. The idea was that sermons should be built around images, not ideas. Preachers should be aiming to create concrete, vivid, colorful pictures in the minds of their listeners. Now, Roy actually practiced what he preached, not every Sunday, but usually he would mount the high pulpit in Unity Church without a manuscript, just his postcards spread out across the lectern like a 3-card flop in a poker game. Now, not every congregation appreciates this style of preaching, and not every preacher likes it either. But here's the point. Roy was trying to wean us away from the language of intellectual abstraction by inviting us to use more concrete, imaginative, and visual language. It made me think of the famous advice given by the Unitarian poet, William Carlos Williams, to younger poets. No ideas but in things, he said. No ideas but in things. I think I have a slide with that phrase on it, which comes from his 1927 poem, Patterson, but I think it's epitomized in his well-known 1962 poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. I know you can visualize in your mind's eye the subject of that poem. The red wheelbarrow glazed with rain beside the white chickens. No ideas, but in things. You can drop that slide now. And as in poetry, so too in preaching. So much depends on the creation of vivid images which become the substance of our religious imagination. Now, I believe that worship is itself an art form. Recent theories and theologies of worship talk about curating worship, as one might curate an art exhibit. The word curate, and again, I think we have a slide here, it derives from an old Latin term meaning to care for. In fact, Anglican clergy, even today, are still called curates. So the connection between curation and worship is not artificial, but organic, you might say. It's all about caring. All curation begins with collection, with gathering, with aggregation, the bringing together of elements that may not seem connected at all, The second step is to select from them and then to organize them in a certain way. It's a little bit like that postcard exercise. So that's what I want to do this morning, to lead you on a little museum tour of a few postcards, curated images that have been important to me, works of art that have exercised and nourished my imagination. So as I have been reflecting recently on my 40 plus years of ministry, I've been pondering the words of Albert Camus. It's the next slide. A man's work, Camus said, is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened. Now, I have to say, I got off to a pretty bad start when it came to artwork, and specifically with crayons. In my kindergarten class one day, we were instructed to lie down on the smooth linoleum floor, not unlike this one, while our classmates drew an outline of our body on butcher paper, and you've probably done this. And then we were supposed to fill it in with crayons, coloring in the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the hair, the clothing, and so on. Well, I guess my 5-year-old mind started to wander, and I started to color outside the lines, way outside the lines. And before long, I was scrawling and scribbling right on the floor, like some budding young Jackson Pollock. And I was sent to the principal's office. And let's just say that I was punished in a way that is no longer permitted in our public schools. So you might, and then ever since, I've kind of been reluctant to draw outside the lines, not just with artwork, but in other ways as well. But it didn't really extinguish my artistic spirit. For some reason, I continued to draw. And I have an example of the next, something I drew when I was very, very young. Next slide shows that. It shows you what I was interested in back then, given my limited color palette. The purple uniforms represent the maroon-clad Two Harbors Agates, and the boys in blue and gold are the Fighting Wildcats of Morgan Park, my dad's alma mater. And as you can see, the Agates have just scored a goal, and they're lifting their sticks in triumph. So to this day, I enjoy paintings that have busy, complex scenes of people actively going about their business, or better yet, playing together. And here are a few examples from the Dutch masters, Peter Bruegel the Elder and Arndt Arntzen. You can just show those next 2 slides real quickly. See, something about that, it resonates very deeply with me. And the next one, that kind of thing has remained with me. I continued to draw through high school, and even took a studio art course in college. And here are a few self-portraits that I drew for an assignment in that class. You can click through those real quickly. That was a long time ago. That was 50 years ago, probably. Some of these. I think that's the last one for now. So I didn't really do much drawing after college, but over the years I have noticed that I return to my sketchbook at times of transition and deep soul searching in my life, in the same way that I often resume my written journals at those times. And indeed, they're often part of the same book. I think you can show the next slide. It's an example of, my journals are always blank books, and so that I can both write and draw. This was actually picture, I remember this was a lecture by Joanna Macy. She has her eyes closed in meditation there, but I took notes, and I somehow it helped me to integrate and take in what I was hearing and seeing. In 2002, I was facing some difficult family transitions, particularly with my 12-year-old son, Nathaniel, who was soon to be moving back to New England with his mother, and I wouldn't be seeing him for a long time. And I was in deep grief, and I didn't always handle it well. I remember finding comfort in a poem written by Robert Bly, It's the next slide. I think you can click to that. It's his poem for my son Noah, 10 years old. He says, "I am proud only of those days that we pass in undivided tenderness. When you sit drawing or making books stapled with messages to the world, or coloring a man with fire coming out of his hair, or we sit at a table with small tea carefully poured, so we pass our time together, calm and delighted." Now, Nathaniel didn't draw any pictures of a man with his hair on fire, but here are some monsters that he drew when he was much younger. One dragon man there. You can click to the next slide. Here's a sketch he made of me preaching that he had drawn when he was 4 years old, and I was serving the church in Detroit. As you can clearly see, I'm wearing my preaching robe, and you'll notice a flaming chalice down there in the foreground. So in 2002, we met in a park, Nathaniel and I, one afternoon in April, and I made this quick sketch, this next slide, of him drawing and writing in his own journal. And then the next slide, this last sketch I made on that same day of him swinging on a swing. And there was something about this that I has come back to. I could have taken a picture, but somehow this captured a moment in time when he was leaving, to go away for, and I wouldn't be seeing him as frequently. And something about I don't want to call it a snapshot because that sounds photographic. It's more like but just the drawing of it was important for me then and now. He went on, actually, much later to major in art and creative writing, so that time in the journal there paid off, I guess. He went to, and here's one of his drawings, the next slide. This is one I picked out, or it's a print, really, I guess. So drawing can be an imaginative, creative, healing, and transformative spiritual practice. It helps us to see the world more clearly and honestly, to touch it with our eyes and our hearts. In his beautiful handwritten and hand-illustrated book, The Zen of Seeing Drawing as Meditation, the artist and spiritual teacher Frederick Frank said, "It is in order to really see ever deeper and ever more intensely, hence to be fully aware and alive, that I draw what the Chinese call the 10,000 things around me." Drawing is the discipline by which I constantly rediscover the world. So drawing or painting can be an active form of meditation and prayer. And on the other hand, viewing art that others have created, receiving and appreciating art, can also be a spiritual practice, a way to nourish and cultivate the soul's creative imagination. So in the spirit of curation, I want to share a few more postcards. I'll walk you through past a few works of art that have had meaning for me. The first image I want to share will probably be recognizable, if not entirely familiar. You can go to the next slide, please. This is Picasso's Guernica. Although I'd visited the original at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and looked at it when it hung there, it was returned to Spain in 1981. But I didn't really see it until I went to jail. And let me explain what I mean by that. In the early 1980s, I was involved in a ministry to inmates at the county jail in Rutland, Vermont. As part of the curriculum we were using, I learned a technique called art forming. And it can be used with any work of art, a painting or a poem or a song or even a film for that matter. But the work of art that we happened to start with was Guernica. Now, art forming uses a series of structured questions that become progressively more personal and self-involving. So, for example, the first question, there were maybe a dozen young men in the room, and we'd look at this picture and I'd say, "What do you notice first?" And we'd go around the circle, and each one would respond. So let me just try that here. What do you notice first? What sort of captures your attention in this? The broken sword. Thank you. What else? Who else? The bright light bulb. The the horse. Yeah. Yeah. The one with tusks. Yeah. Yeah. So people's attention lands on different elements within the thing, and we could go on, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of it. So the second round, the second question: if you could add something to this painting, what would you add? And again, we won't take the time to do that now, but we'd go around. If you could take something away, if you could subtract something, if you could put yourself in this picture somewhere, where would it be? And then, have you ever felt like this? When? So by the time we got to the fifth round, these young men were talking at a deep, personal, vulnerable level. And it was a lesson that I've never forgotten. A work of art has the power to elicit and to evoke powerful healing and transformative responses. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is an established spiritual practice of praying with icons. Icons are pictorial representations, often drawn from some biblical scene, which are used as a focus for contemplative prayer. Focus isn't quite the right word, though. It's more like a window through which the divine gazes at us. In fact, there's the training of icon painters. They use a very completely different sense of perspective, where the vanishing point, if you will, is not in the back of the picture. It's in us. It moves toward us. So here's the next slide is a very famous icon painted by Andrei Rublev called the Trinity. And it depicts the three angels entertained by Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament story, seen by Christian interpreters, of course, as a foreshadowing of the Trinity. But the reason I wanted to show it here is to point toward that open space in the front and center of the icon. You see the chalice on the table, which is surrounded by the abstract form or shape of another chalice, it looks like. But the entire composition invites the viewer to take a seat, to step into this picture, to occupy that empty space. It's in a way, it's its own form, kind of art forming. So whether it's with a sacred icon or a secular but spiritually powerful work like Guernica, the idea is for us to enter into the scene. The next postcard I want to show is the Garden of Earthly Delights. This may have to be the last one. I'm noticing the time, but this is a famous triptych painted by Hieronymus Bosch between 1490 and 1510. It's 13 feet by 7 feet, and it hangs in the Prado in Madrid, Spain. And there's some detail. You can click through the next 5 slides pretty quickly. Just some details here. Close-up details. Actually, Diane and I, true confessions, during COVID, we did a jigsaw puzzle of this, 1,000 pieces. So I got to know it pretty well that way. I've never been to Madrid, but it's an amazing painting. So you can go to the last frame then, which shows the large one again. I first became familiar with this painting by reading a book by Terry Tempest Williams called Leap. And it describes her encounter with this painting. How many of you know Terry Tempest Williams' work? She's an environmental, known especially as an environmental activist and writer. Beautiful, beautiful person. I was on a panel with her once on religion and the environment. It was hosted by our church in Indianapolis, and I'm jumping around here in my manuscript, but at that meeting, I was sitting right next to her, and I was introduced as a Unitarian Universalist, and she was introduced as representing the Mormon perspective, and she adamantly interrupted the moderator and said, the elders of my church would be very upset to hear you say that. She said, I'm not. She's grew up in a Mormon family and environment, and there's much about the heritage that she values, but she made a decisive break from it and just wanted to be clear about that. But she had won, she was a well-known writer. She had won a grant that enabled her to travel to Madrid numerous times, a dozen times, and just sit for a week in front of this painting, taking notes, sketching, talking to other people, and then, by the way, it goes without saying that this would be a great candidate for art forming, right? And Bosch, who in Spain is known as El Bosco, became her intimate creative partner, you might say. And she wrote this book about the painting, but in alternating chapters, she wrote about, the book was about the fate of the creative imagination in art and in religion once the organizers get a hold of it. So what do the art dealers and the, do with artwork? How does that affect it? And what do the organizers have to do with religious imagination and inspiration? So she looked at the work of Joseph Smith, who was nothing if not imaginative, the founder of the Mormon tradition, a very imaginative man. So she wrote about him, and then the next chapter would be about this painting. It's not an easy book, but it's a very rewarding book. In fact, so much so that I read it and I decided to teach a class on it at my church in Indianapolis. Advertised it, sent it out. 7 o'clock came, nobody showed. I was getting ready to pack up my slides and my materials, and one woman showed up. She had driven 45 miles. She was a junior high school art teacher, not a member of our congregation. She read about it. She showed up, and we had a wonderful conversation for an hour and a half, and so it was well worth doing. It was the right person. So, okay, I'm going to do one last thing here. If you can click to the next slide. This is John Tolley, retired professor at Meadville Lombard. When I was working on my doctor of ministry program there, I took a class with him called Arts in the Ministry, popular class. He often taught it. Wonderful man. And the highlight of his class was always a field trip to the Art Institute of Chicago. It was always on a Thursday night when it was free. And here's a picture of the front entrance of that great institution, one of the great art museums in the country, if not the world. And here, the next slide shows what you see when you first enter a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte by George Seurat. If any of you ever saw Sunday in the Park with George, the musical, that's, talk about art forming. People come into and out of the painting, literally. Here, next slide shows on the famous American icon that hangs on the wall. And the assignment in this museum, in this class, was to fan out for an hour and find, kind of like the postcards, find a painting or find a work of art that spoke to us in some way, right? And then the second hour, we'd take our classmates on a tour. We'd go around, and each classmate would describe what it was about that painting. So I'll show you the painting I chose. There are lots of possibilities, but this is it doesn't show up very well. It's very dark. There's a little hand down in the corner you see reaching around. It's sometimes called The Door. That which I should have done, I did not do. So I won't, again, I could art form that. What is it about that? Why did that painting speak to me at that time? Frankly, I don't remember, but at the time it was very important. So that you see how you can use that kind of structured reception or perception of paintings as a kind of spiritual practice. I think I'm going to skip the last one just in view of time. You can run through it real quickly because just skip. This is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. The broken obelisk by Barnett Newman, the sculpture out in the reflecting pool. And you can go through real quickly the next. These are canvases by Rothko, well known for his utterly simple. This is Rothko himself. And then here's the interior of the chapel. I put that up there. You can see some subtle, faint gradations in tone, but it's just a dark canvas, but it's not a dark place. But the reason I put it up here is to compare it with Hieronymus Bosch and the busy, almost psychedelic activity in Bosch's painting. And here is Rothko, who was a deep student of Buddhism. Really, what you're seeing here is just the non-representative portrayal of a state of mind, you might say. It's a very, again, I spent hours here sitting just with others quietly in this space. It's a beautiful, beautiful space in Houston. Okay, you can drop that. It's very different from Rublev's icon as well. This is an icon, but it is somehow opaque. So what kind of a experience do we have when we're faced with ourselves, really? In his book, When Art Disrupts Religion, Aesthetic Experience and the Evangelical Mind, Philip Jenkins describes a young fundamentalist, American fundamentalist, who sat in front of Rothko's work, and he said he was immobilized for 5 hours, and everything came undone for him. He said it was really remarkable. I mean, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it just had that effect on it, and art can. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke made a famous poem about seeing a statue in the museum in Berlin, and he was so arrested by its beauty, even though it was a fragment of an old Greek statue, but it was so beautiful. It just froze him in. And the last line of his poem is, "Du musst dein Leben ändern." You must make your life over. You must change your life because of this beauty. It's just, there's a demand that somehow I live my life differently because of this work of art. That can happen. That does happen. Now, art critics and consumers and connoisseurs can be very fussy and even obnoxious. We know that. But so can religious professionals and fanatical believers, as Terry Tempest Williams knew. The visual arts have the power to reveal to us the depths of nature and of human nature, to engage our imagination as we create images to express ourselves, and as we receive and appreciate and imaginatively engage with the creative work of others. Art can reveal the sacred, the transcendent, the limits of our understanding as well. So, here's what you can do. You can visit an art museum. Long time ago, Julia Cameron, in her book, The Artist's Way, popularized the idea of an artist's date, to make an appointment and a commitment with yourself to spend some time each week. It doesn't have to be an art museum, but going somewhere just to practice that kind of aesthetic spirituality, we might say. Her book, by the way, is a wonderful self-guided adult curriculum that many you have used. But I encourage you to go visit a museum. Museums are sacred spaces. Make an artist date with yourself or with someone else. And then the last thing is create your own art. That's what those crayons are for. Not to do it all with that. That symbolize that. That's your creativity. We sang a song from the poet and artist William Blake earlier. Great great visionary artist and poet. And I remember once going to the British Library in London, and there happened to be a display of his notebooks. And because I'm very interested in William Blake, and I was amazed to see how crude and raw and just messy and sloppy his notebooks were. And it was so liberating. It's just saying, this is just doodle. Don't care what anybody thinks about it. So with your crayon or with your pencil or with whatever instrument you choose, exercise your own creativity. That too is a spiritual practice, and you have that creative power within you. So I'm going to leave it there and hope to pick up a conversation during the coffee